now keenly aware of the fact that they were not alone and not necessarily well received by all of these inhabitants. Colony decided perhaps there was something of an urgent matter to address concerning their security. The nature of the threat perhaps could be assessed in the morning. After all, it was only a nurse who had come to them under apparently no duress at all. A person of whom they knew nothing, that was the seeming target of this unstoppable organization, as the fat man had said. Perhaps they could be negotiated with. McPherson took the moment to leave. She was rather uncomfortable with the idea of sleeping next to Doctor, but her nurse's nature wore out after all. He'd been injured. Maybe she'd help him? No, he was fine. After all, he'd only taken a bit of a beating. He'd shot her. He'd shot her with a shotgun at close range. That hurt very bad. You could have made the argument that she'd be just as well off if she'd fought the large man by herself. Heavens. But she couldn't bear to raise her hand against another. Not anymore. Perhaps she, could do something about her situation, however. It wasn't exactly raising a hand in violence if she just availed herself of the prisoner's clothing and wore it. She needed pants. Really? It made her feel much better to no longer have her posterior exposed to the elements. Even if she set about barefoot, she had pants. Perhaps in exchange she'd feed him. It was the humane thing to do. He was their prisoner. Been somewhat kindly to her a moment ago as she'd entered. Perhaps he wasn't all bad necessarily. She wasn't exactly sure about him, but she had in fact fled from this allegedly unstoppable organization, from whence he claimed to hail. During the interim, she decided that she would take a moment to examine this chair that Jane had made, with no small degree of fervor. It was a chair of such excellent quality that Jane had taken to calling it the hippopotamus. It was an engraving illustrating Jerry Fleming being killed, seemingly without remorse. A blacksmith watched silently beneath the main subject. There is an opossum in the background, and the style is complex and realistic. Who was Jerry? Only Jane knew, and she was loath to speak of the matter. The night passed without incident. The visiting merchant caravan seemed to have appreciated the table just as well as anyone else in the colony, frankly. And then, the strangest thing. A cluster of cargo pods dropped nearby. Rather close nearby. It must have been some belated debris. Strangely, contained nothing but a number of bandages for one's ear, ergonomically designed to treat even the most unseemly of ear wounds. In the event that ears should be such a point of interest among the colonists, they at least had the reassurance they would be taken care of with the finest of medical advances. Doctor decided perhaps it was time to speak with this smelly person. He gestured to Sarge, who accompanied him to the prisoner's room. Sarge thought perhaps Jane should be here as well. They were, after all, the three who had come together initially on this terrible escape. They were the initial three that had survived without so much as a scratch the exodus of the ship. The others, they were on the original ship as well, but there was just something different about them. Jane, Sarge, and Doctor shared a certain kind of bond. And so Doctor began his query as he languidly allowed his shotgun to rest in a position which could perhaps compromise Smelly the cook's well-being, asked him of this unstoppable organization. The fat man, still struggling under his wounds, revealed nothing short of the unstoppable organization as being a pirate band, flush with members, teeming with loot and armor and weapons, thieves, brigands, highwaymen, roustabout the lot of them, headed by one Priscilla Bellerose, so named for her warlike nature and unparalleled beauty, so he said. It seemed the unstoppable organization was an enemy of everyone. Every sort of organization on the planet. Most notably comedians, Cliff. It was during this time they heard of a place called Cook's Plain and the Red Hippopotamus Chonka, some sort of tribal organization. Also a place called the Black Hornets. Was it a place, or was it simply another pirate band? Time would tell. Time would tell indeed. Smelly seemed to indicate that Sarge was the leader of the colony, point to which Doctor silently scoffed in his head, but did not argue, necessarily, not now. Sarge rather appreciated this sort of obeisance, and suggested perhaps Smelly might tell this unstoppable organization they could stop any time they pleased. And if he didn't, he'd be glad to make the point for them. Smelly, seeing the expression on the grizzled veteran's face, realized he had really no good way out of this conversation one way or another, and simply assured the man that the unstoppable organization would in fact come and destroy their home. Jane had been silent at this time. Up until the fat man spoke of home. Something triggered in her. Something clicked. Home. That's what this place was, not just to her, but to everyone else here. She squared her jaw and narrowed her eyes and looked at the fat man laying on the flattened pile of dirt, and she said in a voice that neither Sarge nor Doctor had ever heard before, one filled with courage, one filled with determination, and said, "You may be a bandit, but I am a woman. And my home will be a fortress, and my house shall be a fort. I will make my room an armory, and a palisade for a picket fence. My bed will be a munitions crate, and we will make weapons at the breakfast table. For I am a woman, and I am come to make a home." With that, she stormed out of the room, and immediately set about to working. Sarge and Doctor sort of looked at one another for a moment. And then Sarge decided that was quite enough of that. Doctor, for his part, waited for a moment for Sarge to leave. He thought, perhaps they didn't need this person. Perhaps they didn't need any of him. The caravan was here. The caravan master indicated he had a somewhat peculiar taste. But no, they were beginning to leave. There was no time for that. Sarge had once heard something that he shared with Doctor about cars, how primitive vehicles could be disassembled and sold on the black market for a sum greater than their parts. Doctor would have explored this fascinating predicament had the caravan not begun to leave with surprising alacrity. There was no way he could reach them now, surely. Not for his cries of protest. Across the plains they fled with their cougars and their buffalo. Rose, one of the people accompanying the caravan, mentioned it was a good little jog in the rain for the lot of them to have here. And so Doctor forsook his ill designs in favor of merely harvesting a raspberry bush. Perhaps the traders would come back. Perhaps everything would be as he thought it should be. In the meantime, Coley took to chatting politely with the fat man named Smelly. It wasn't so bad, really. He was just smelly. Naked, morbidly obese, and potentially wanted to kill them all, you understand. It wasn't that he was a bad man, he was just a pirate. The rain did little to dampen their efforts in cutting down as many trees as they possibly could, for Jane seemed to have something of a plan, really. And evidently, she would need as much wood as one could possibly get. Something about the palisade for a picket fence seemed to stick in the minds of the listeners. Well, Beard wasn't going to let that stand in his way in terms of research. He did indicate that perhaps it would be very nice to have a light source, perhaps? Other than whatever could shine in through the cracks in the door. Best they could do for the moment is make some sort of a torch. There's a great deal of steel that was still going to be required for the solar generator. That seems something of a secondary issue. Doctor had taken to eating raw meat. Oh, the humanity of it all. Because he was so dreadfully hungry. Things were not as they should be, and their food situation was becoming increasingly bleak. More animals would have to die, or else the colonists would begin to die. Who would be first? Sarge recognized the urgency of their situation. And immediately after felling the tree, set about to hunting game. There was just something about striking things from distance as they hid behind existing slate walls from previous structures that excited him, but this time saw him much better results, truly. No, Macy, don't consume the ibex meat, she thought. Unceremoniously dropping it on the floor. A dreadful thing it was, truly, to be reduced to such a state. Over the cutting of the trees. Poor Aiden tried to create a romance with Jane once again, but got a cold, mechanical shoulder. Oh, if only Aiden knew the truth. Clearly, the threat of invasion was nothing to stand away in allowing love to blossom. As a wise man once said, love could blossom even on a battlefield. Aiden wondered if there could be a future for himself and Jane. She was such a kind and gentle lady. He was a lieutenant. Educated. Austere. Handsome, one might say. Could she see him that way? Could she really? Could she indeed? Macy was becoming increasingly frenetic with the lack of food. Had to remind herself constantly to build roofs over the exposed batteries, which, while not yet charged, would soon be so. Fortunately, it was just enough time for Aiden to finish cooking a stout meal of ibex meat for her. She devoured it with gratitude. The poor raccoon was beginning to starve. It once fled the room as soon as Macy opened the door for him. Macy approached him with some delicious meat. But the raccoon decided it was time to go. He'd watched over the colony for long enough. He'd come to realize what kind of person Doctor was. Dr. Alexander Villain. The colony had run into adversity. They'd made their decision to make a stand. It was admirable, truly. But he was just a raccoon. He had a life to live. Trees to climb. Streams in which to wash his hands. Probably a garbage pile or two to explore. He had lofty ambitions. He aspired to the greatness that only a raccoon can seek to aspire to. It was time to move on. Perhaps he'd come back someday. Perhaps not.